Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University, and we're glad to have you joining us this week right here on KTRL 90.5 FM. We are here each week on Sundays at noon, and we also stream at this time on tarletonradio.com. If you missed the show on Sundays or you want to listen to previous episodes, you can always go to SoundCloud and see our full archive of recent shows. We post on Facebook so that you can see what we are talking about each week, the issues that we're covering, and you can also download wherever you get your podcasts. So lots of ways to listen to On Politics and stay up with some of the most pressing issues and some quality analysis of major things that are happening in the world of politics and policy today. We're very glad today to welcome back to the show Dr. Malcolm Cross, Professor of Political Science at Tarleton State. And as always, Dr. Cross, our resident expert here on the presidency and the executive. He teaches a class to our students, but also is always willing and able to offer commentary on all things presidential. And we did have some significant, or at least a milestone that we hit this last week. And so we asked Dr. Cross to come on and to talk about the significance of 100 days. This is something in terms of the presidency and what expectations are there, and at least the kind of focus that are put on political agenda and, of course, promises kept, at least in terms of that time period, or at least where the administration may be going, and to have a check. So first of all, welcome, Dr. Cross. We're glad to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks, Eric. Thanks for inviting me back. Thanks for your very generous introduction as well. Glad to be back.
Very good. Well, we always appreciate your insight as well as the humor sometimes that goes along with it in terms of your knowledge of these issues, but also helping us to understand their place historically and as well as what their significance are today politically. And so the first question really is 100 days. I mean, I'm not sure that we could go back to George Washington and look at the media of that time. We might, I don't know. I think I'm asking you that question to see, where did this come from? Why the first 100 days? Why so much emphasis is placed on this time period for a presidential administration?
Well, this goes back to the first term of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected president in November 1932, and then he was inaugurated president on March 4th, 1933. It would not be until 1936 that we would move up inauguration dates to January 20th. But President Roosevelt was determined to begin America's effort to recover from the Great Depression, and during the first 100 days of his administration, the Congress, at his behest, passed much of the original New Deal legislation. And ever since that time, 100 days has been kind of the benchmark against which future presidents, or subsequent presidents rather, have been judged. So whenever a new president takes office, he's going to be judged by what he's done during the first 100 days in memory of President Roosevelt.
Does this have an impact on how they design their agenda then in that case, since this has become now, at least for, approaching a century now, we have this as a marker for a presidential administration in terms of their planning as they're coming into office? How do they view that? I mean, is that something that really tries to guide that agenda, at least early on, and knowing what they can get done right away?
Yes. Political scientists who've studied the effectiveness of presidents as lawmakers have noted that if a president offers his agenda at the beginning of his administration, he's more likely to be accorded a honeymoon period by the Congress. The Congress frequently wants him to succeed. He's a new incoming president, and many people have their hopes pinned on him and on his success. Besides, time for opposition to organize itself has not yet been enough. So, after a couple of months, opposition begins to get organized and begins to push back against the president. So sophisticated presidents know that if they can hit the ground running and have a legislative agenda ready to present as soon as they're inaugurated, they're going to be more likely to succeed, partly because of the goodwill that's normally extended to them by Congress, and partly because the opposition has not yet gotten its act together. And presidential scholars point out that presidents should begin planning their agenda not before their inauguration, but before their actual election. And presidential candidates will frequently begin developing agendas, developing lists of men and women whom they want to nominate for office, after they've been nominated by their parties, but before they've been elected. And if they're defeated, then their efforts ultimately go for nothing. But if they're elected, they can really hit the ground running.
So some would compare, and I've seen this in a few places, where they would look back at Franklin Roosevelt, look at him coming into office, and then look at the Biden administration coming into office with the pandemic, with the economic impact of it. I mean, this is a significant events that have been happening that have impacted the nation as a whole. But of course, we can look back at President Obama with the Great Recession. You can look back, I guess, to Reagan. At least in terms of the modern presidency, how does this first 100 days compare in terms of what was there that a presidential administration would have to address and have to have as their primary focus? Is this really that unusual that there is some level of crisis or some challenges that a presidential administration has to be prepared for as they come into office?
That's frequently the case. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980 following the Iranian hostage crisis, double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment on President Carter's watch, and he was promising to have legislation introduced that would address these issues, and his supporters in Congress were prepared to help carry them out. One saw right off the bat serious consideration given to his tax cut proposals to try to jumpstart the economy, consideration given to his proposals to accelerate the defense buildup begun by President Carter following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Similarly, President Obama took office as we were sliding into the Great Recession and immediately wanted to address various issues, an early stimulus package, as well as the adoption of health care. As far as President Biden is concerned, the twin issues he wants to address are, first of all, the pandemic. And to that end, he's accelerated the distribution of vaccines that began to be produced as a result of former President Trump's Operation Warp Speed. And he also wants to accelerate American economic recovery through a stimulus package that has already been passed by the Congress, thereby chalking up his first great win. And the Democrats have made much of the need to take more effective action on climate change as well, and hence Green New Deal proposals will probably be on the table during tonight's address to the nation.
Sure. Yes. And we're recording this in advance of that address. And I think that was one of my questions for you with looking kind of into the future a little bit with this about what he's going to propose. But many are saying that this will be a large request for an infrastructure package that, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And what we've seen in this, at least in the first 100 days, related to the stimulus, related to addressing the pandemic. Of course, some of these there's been some consensus that we need this level of spending to address some of that. But of course, it's moving further along in terms of this focus on domestic issues. And I want to get to the foreign policy side in a moment. But I guess some of the challenges that are presented to the administration is that a lot of what things that are being proposed cost a significant amount of money. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at here in terms of whether it's a legacy issue or whether what the Biden administration is able to accomplish in this term or not. Where do we look back to find any examples? I mean, is it all the way back to FDR, or is it others where the way forward was proposing significant amount of spending that in an attempt to try to get past the crisis with the hopes that if things improve, then you're looking back and saying, okay, well, how do we pay all this off? Because we were already in significant debt, even coming out of the Trump administration with the pandemic hitting as well. I mean, it just seems like it's compounding. And I'm wondering how that would compare to another 100 days that we may have seen with a previous presidential administration.
Well, I think the best analogy would be FDR's New Deal. One could also make some comparisons with the Great Society program of President Johnson. But if you look at some of what President Biden has been talking about and what he's likely to propose either tonight or within the foreseeable future, we see things like a $1.9 trillion American rescue plan, a pandemic relief bill, a 2.3, well, that's already been passed, but we also see a $2.3 trillion American jobs plan or infrastructure bill that President Biden is advocating, a $1.8 trillion American families plan to facilitate greater access to higher education, New Deal for cities, a Green New Deal for public housing, all sorts of programs that collectively could send federal spending in excess of $6 trillion above what was being spent before Joe Biden became president. And this is an enormous jump in spending that President Biden is proposing, and much greater, I think, than what President Johnson was proposing for the Great Society. So I think really the best analogy was the New Deal programs being proposed by President Franklin Roosevelt. Although if you go back and look at the history of the New Deal, much of the money that he was talking about being spent on the New Deal programs is positively dwarfed by what President Biden and the Democrats are proposing now. And I think that one of the reasons why President Biden and the Democrats want to be so ambitious in pursuing these goals is that they realize that there's a good chance that they could lose at least one, if not both houses of the Congress in 2022. So they probably see this 2-year period before the next elections as being their window of opportunity, and they've got to take maximum advantage of it before the window of opportunity closes with the 2022 general congressional elections.
Yeah, it's very likely in looking at some of the, I guess, the tea leaves here politically that these attempts to get these policies passed and the focus on spending. I mean, we could look back to the President Obama with his the Affordable Care Act, and then of course that had an impact on the midterm elections. That this could either way. I mean, that if the possibility that they were going to lose control of Congress, or that this would influence that as well, which it certainly will. It's going to be another probably very close election in many ways to see who retains control of one house or the other. This also, I was thinking too, this dwarfs even coming out of the Bush administration into the Obama administration, the toxic asset relief, the bailout of the auto industry. I mean, there you were talking about, $1.5 to $2 trillion, which was seemed just enormous at that time. And here we're talking about upwards of $6 trillion. I'm wondering, again, and this may help our listeners in terms of presidential politics and looking at it from the perspective of the two different parties and kind of the way that they approach the role that government has. Certainly the Biden administration coming in and seeing that government is part of the solution here, and a very aggressive focus on various policy areas is significant. What does what is the outcome here that Democrats hope to achieve that would help to pay for this in the long run? Again, I think, what we might see from the Republican side would be more either measured or targeted, or maybe not such as broad of programs as what is being proposed. But I think that's always the question that comes to mind. I think, especially coming out of the Trump administration, where we didn't always see conservative economic principles applied. And now we have a Biden administration where that's not even on the table. It's more of, we've got to focus here of what we can do and accomplish. And I think the average person out there kind of struggles with that. How do they think that this will turn out in terms of being able to pay back this massive amount of debt that is a part of this very first 100 days aggressive agenda?
Well, first of all, it ought to be kept in mind that both parties really believe in big government in pursuit of their policy goals. They do have different policy goals. So the Republicans are more likely to want big government in the area of national security, national defense. The Democrats more so in the area of domestic spending. As far as debt and paying back the debt, it is absolutely certain, beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt, that our national deficit and our national debt are going to skyrocket under the Democrats. Although, to be perfectly fair to the Democrats, the Republicans have certainly allowed massive debts and deficits to accumulate during the Reagan administration and during the George W. Bush administration, and now during the Donald Trump administration. As far as trying to pay back the debt is concerned, both parties have their myths about how you can pay back the debt. The Democrats tell us falsely that if you simply tax the rich, you can generate enough money to bring deficit and debt under control. The big problem is that there simply aren't enough rich people with enough money to be able to pull that one off. Now, the Republicans have their own myth. They tell us falsely that if you cut taxes enough, you will stimulate enough economic growth so that the tax cuts will pay for themselves and generate more money. That has simply not happened since this myth was first introduced at the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1981. The plain, blunt truth of the matter is that both parties are utterly irresponsible when it comes to fiscal management, deficits, and debt. I'm absolutely convinced that if private corporations ran their businesses with the same lack of integrity with which the Democratic and the Republican parties govern America's finances, every corporation in America would promptly become bankrupt, and every corporate leader would promptly be sent to prison for misappropriation of funds and all sorts of other financial sins.
Well, I think this is where the politics comes into play too, because it looks like, especially if we're talking about the first 100 days and then how that sets the tone for the administration, but it seems like the focus is on those political wins, those policy wins that connect with enough constituents to help you to maintain power and position in terms of within government. And so a lot of this looks like that especially in the policies that Biden is proposing, will target certain areas. Now, whether that, again, will benefit them in the midterm or work against them, that's yet to be seen. But I think it's important that people understand that the politics of all of this outweigh, it seems like, and we've seen this over and over again, that fiscal responsibility, because sometimes making those hard decisions fiscally are not very popular politically. And to me, and I don't know, Malcolm, I guess this is a question I have, that a first 100-day agenda, yes, it may be focused on critical issues that need to be addressed, and this is the person that's been elected to do this, but it is very much imbued with politics, very much imbued with what someone can accomplish and how they can maintain power, and as well as address the constituents that helped put them into office. In terms of your kind of insight on that, I mean, put percentages here, 50%, okay, it's pragmatic, focused on policy issues and so on, and the other half's politics. But how much do you see that in the mix here as we look ahead to midterms, as we look to 2024? Because some of these things that are being proposed are going to move well beyond that in years, in terms of, especially if you look at infrastructure and so on, in terms of what can be funded. And as we know, these very large programs, once they are in place, they're very hard to remove. And so we see government kind of locked in to certain things that may be but may be with us for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that both Democrats and Republicans alike hope, first of all, that good politics and good policy are intertwined. You implement programs that are beneficial. The people will reward you with re-election. And so you really can't separate the politics from the policy. They're kind of like conjoined Siamese twins. You can't separate them. Each needs the other to survive. Okay. I tend to think that, as I've indicated, the Democrats want to get as much done now, partly because they no doubt think that their policies are going to be genuinely beneficial, partly because they think they're not going to have a chance after 2022. One pattern of politics that both the Democrats and the Republicans ought to be careful of, but especially the Democrats, is this. Both Bill Clinton in 1993, his first year as president, tried to pursue an ambitious program of tax increases to help pare down the deficit, as well as national health care. And he was widely regarded, he and the Democrats were widely regarded as overreaching. And the Democrats lost both houses of Congress in 1994. In 1994, for the first time in 40 years, the Republicans actually won the House of Representatives, and they knocked out about 50 or 60 Democrats in the process. Similarly, Barack Obama, pursuing big ticket stimulus items and Obamacare, provoked a backlash that resulted in the loss of about 50 seats in for the Democrats in the House of Representatives, Republican takeover of the House, and President Biden may well be courting this problem as well. The House of Representatives, well, the Senate is evenly balanced right now between Democrats and Republicans. The House of Representatives almost evenly balanced, and the switch of maybe 3 or 4 seats could give the Republicans the majority in the speakership. And it could well be that the American people will perceive President Biden's program as so overreaching that there'll be a reaction against it once people settle down and begin thinking about the question of how are we going to pay for all this. Biden, and for that matter, ever since we've had the national debt, which has been, the current debt began to accumulate during the administration of President Martin Van Buren, who was elected president in 1836. Under his predecessor, Andrew Jackson, the national debt was paid off. But ever since then, we've been taking a buy now, pay later approach, and the national debt has grown so great that it could well become a buy now, pay never approach. Mm-hmm. But people are going to start wondering, how do we pay for all this? And it's interesting to note that Biden is proposing new spending programs now and promising to introduce new tax programs to pay for them. But we're getting to spending first and the taxing later, if we get it at all.
Yeah. Well, back to the 100 days as a way to kind of wrap up here. If you look at the Biden administration, I know the AP and others have had these stories out where they say, well, he's kept about 2/3 of the promises that he's made, and some are in progress and all that. But I think in terms of your knowledge of the presidency and what the Biden administration has had to take on, and what is the extent of of the promises and the things that he's addressed in these first 100 days. How does this compare? Is it too aggressive? Is it too many areas? Too broad? Is it? Do you see it as meeting some of the main issues at the forefront at the moment? How do you see this in comparison with other presidents in the modern presidency in terms of an agenda for the first 100 days?
Well, scholars who've studied the legislative successes of presidents tell us that a legislative program is most likely to succeed not only if it is offered at the beginning of the president's term, but also if it is either relatively short in agenda items or at the very least is organized around a common theme, a common approach. One of the most unsuccessful presidents in terms of presenting a legislative agenda was President Jimmy Carter, who had numerous proposals that he shot up to Congress during his first 100 days, but there was no common theme. There were simply too many proposals offered, no organizing principle that anyone could discern. Now, if you look at, say, President Johnson or President Franklin Roosevelt or President Theodore Roosevelt, really the first president to offer a comprehensive legislative agenda, you had a common organizing principle, namely expanding the power of the federal government to solve social problems on which a public consensus had developed that these problems have got to be solved. When Ronald Reagan became president, he had a relatively short agenda. Cut taxes, raise defense spending, and these might seem to be pretty contradictory, but there weren't too many proposals really that he was offering. And so the Congress was able to get its collective mind about it. Same with George W. Bush. Cut taxes, launched the No Child Left Behind Act. Those were his two big ticket items before 9/11 hit him. As far as Joe Biden is concerned, the weakness of his legislative agenda is that he may be asking for too much, too soon, with too high a price tag. The strength of his legislative agenda is that there is still a very discernible common theme, namely expanded government action to handle the pandemic, handle unemployment, handle climate change. The expanded government action is the unifying principle, and that strengthens his legislative agenda. That, plus the fact that the Democrats want him to succeed before the election, increases the chances that probably most of his agenda will, in point of fact, be adopted. They want him to succeed now because once the midterm comes, the chances for success go down.
Right. Well, and especially since he had said initially about being a one-term president. We'll see what happens, but that could even make it more of a lame duck presidency if the Republicans gain control of Congress. I wanted to ask you one last question that I thought of was domestic versus foreign policy agenda. Again, this has been very heavy domestic, other than the focus on the border. Last week, I had Dr. Tony Payan, if you remember, from Rice, who came and he spoke. Last week we talked about border issues and really some of the challenges that were not expected for the Biden administration there. But it seems like that this is a very, very heavy domestic agenda and very short on foreign policy and those in certain areas there. And I didn't know in terms of looking at these kinds of policy agendas for the first 100 days. And maybe this is where it needs to be, because you're right. There is a theme there of addressing the pandemic, unemployment, getting the economy back on track, or at least growing. Where does this stand if we look back in terms of comparing the first 100 days? Does this create some issues and some concerns that foreign policy is not really as strong and visible in his policy agenda as it has been for other presidents?
Well, it's typically been the case that presidents have emphasized domestic affairs over foreign affairs, mainly because the American people are more interested in domestic affairs, and a presidency will be made or broken more on domestic affairs than foreign affairs, especially on the state of the economy. As a general rule, no president of the United States can win re-election if the public does not like the state of the economy at the time the president is up for re-election. Doesn't matter what his foreign policy triumphs may be. For example, in 1991, George H.W. Bush, following the first Persian Gulf War, had approval ratings in excess of 90%. And the public loved the way that he organized the coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein and drive him out of Kuwait. And his astronomically high popularity ratings discouraged heavy-hitting Democrats like Lloyd Bentsen, Mario Cuomo, Sam Nunn from seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, leading to the rise of second-tier candidates like Bill Clinton. But just 18 months later, President Bush was defeated for re-election, winning the smallest percentage of the popular vote, other than William Howard Taft, of any incumbent running for re-election. He got 38% of the vote. And the reason was public dissatisfaction with the economy. That trumped all of Bush's foreign policy triumphs. He was considered a genius at foreign policy, but that counted for diddly squat in the 1992 election. So domestic politics is normally a president's chief preoccupation, partly because the American people care more about domestic politics, especially inflation and unemployment, and partly because presidents know that their terms will be made or broken more on the basis of domestic politics, and especially the economy, than on anything else. Now, some presidents discover that they have to become, contrary to their desires, foreign policy presidents when the foreign policy crisis that nobody foresees begins to take over. One thinks of World War II, 9/11. Lyndon Johnson wanted desperately to be a great domestic policy president, got himself bogged down in Vietnam, and felt he ultimately had to retire.
Very good.
Domestic policy is the big one.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that analysis on all fronts. I mean, I think that helps us to put this in context, that this is not just a marker along the way, but that as the presidential administration is preparing to come into office, their focus and why this is so significant, both in terms of politics, but also in getting an agenda off in the direction that they want it to go. And of course, knowing that elections are coming up in 2022. I mean, that's always, I think, I've brought that up on several aspects of the show. In fact, a few weeks ago, we talked about people who are considered GOP frontrunners, just reminding people that this cycle never ends. As soon as we finish an election and install a new president, it all ramps up again for the next one. But yes, go ahead, Malcolm. Yes,
I was about to say that not only is the 2024 presidential election already underway beneath the surface, but people are probably thinking in terms of 2028 and 2032. It is not unusual for people to be contemplating presidential elections 2 cycles, 3 cycles out.
Right. Very good. Well, thank you again, Malcolm. This is great to have you on the show again, and to have this your great analysis and perspective on these types of issues. And it's a benefit to our listeners to really understand and go a little bit deeper in the significance of the first 100 days of the presidency. So thank you, and we'll look forward to having you back on the show again soon.
Well, I enjoyed it and always happy to help out.
We will take a quick break, and we will be back for more On Politics.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow, and we hope you joined us for that first part of the show where we interviewed Dr. Malcolm Cross regarding the first 100 days of the Biden administration. So some great information there. If you missed that, you can catch it on SoundCloud after the show airs. You can also download where you get your podcasts. But I would encourage you to go back and listen to that and understanding why this is significant, going back to FDR and all presidents coming forward about that first 100 days in office and what is the significance of that milestone. And some great insight and analysis, as always, from Dr. Cross. I want to go back to one of the issues that I brought up at the end of the show last week, and that is the new anti-riot laws that have been passed in several states. Last week, we started looking at these in Florida and Oklahoma, just to kind of set this up in this environment post-election, the presidential election back in November, when we now see some of this focus on certain things. One has been voter security versus voter restrictions. And I'm using that terminology because this is what's coming from different sides and different perspectives of these laws that are focused on kind of tightening up voting requirements and what, especially here in Texas, what local election officials are able to do, what latitude they have. And of course, I've been trying to be balanced in all of this to look at the pragmatic aspects of it, that yes, there always are concerns about voter fraud. Even though the data doesn't show that that's widespread, that still doesn't mean you do not put the mechanisms in place to prevent it. But on the other side, some of the things that local officials have been doing are costly. They then require higher levels of security. And so there's some legitimacy to raising these concerns, but then there's also then the argument that we need to look at, how do we make voting more accessible? How do we accommodate people who can't drive, or people who don't have cars, or people, like in this case, the pandemic, that the exposure possibilities to COVID-19. And what we're not seeing is that discussion in the middle of what's really pragmatic, what's doable, what's maybe cost effective in the delivery of elections. And so I put these laws about they're calling anti-rioting in the same category because you already have lawsuits filed about these laws and against them, saying that they're unconstitutional, they're attacking the right to speech and assembly and so forth. And that's on the one side. The other side is the fact that local governments and even state governments are concerned about the impact of rioting and the costliness of it, the expense of it. How do you respond to it? And so just looking at the law in Florida for just a moment and kind of talking about some of the aspects of it, the new crimes that have been identified in the law in Florida is targeted at aggravated rioting, which makes it a felony, and mob intimidation becomes a first-degree misdemeanor in which 3 or more people use violence or the threat of it to change someone's views. Lawmakers said the measure, which is punishable by a sentence of up to 1 year, comes in response to viral incidents in which crowds of protesters would confront diners eating at outdoor restaurants. Other misdemeanors include such blocking a highway during a demonstration. They've been bumped up to felonies. So anyone in Florida arrested in certain riot-related crimes will not be able to post bail until their first court appearance. And anyone convicted of a felony under the law could lose their right to vote. The law also increases protections to those responding to demonstrations, granting civil legal immunity to drivers who run through crowds of protesters, and ramps up consequences of property damage during moments of unrest. It also focuses here that on Confederate monuments and other historic property received additional protection, while anyone whose property is damaged during a riot can sue a local government. Okay, so this puts a more responsibility on local governments to provide protection, property protection in these kinds of events. Now, you can see from reading that there's a mixture of things here, especially some of these incidents that have happened where motor vehicles have been used against protesters. Of course, some of these events have had violence and have seen property destruction. And so there's a lot, again, of positioning in terms of the politics of this. But what I don't see in this is that, again, that discussion about what's the best way forward to deal with this. It's being handled by those kind of on the edges who are trying to engage with this in a way that pushes back at the other side. And of course, a lot of policy in a lot of policy making that happens, especially with controversial issues, and especially issues that may test the boundaries of constitutional rights, like we're looking at here. So where is this going to go? Well, we're going to see the court challenges to some of this. So it means that some of the laws may be, some of the aspects of these new laws may be curtailed or they may be let stand. That is dependent upon how far it goes in the legal system. On the other side of it, it's the testing of it. When we have these particular events and things happen, and then people file lawsuits over using this law, or government takes action using these new laws. But in this polarized environment that we're in, you have different people taking different sides, looking at it politically, looking at it as the other side trying to infringe upon the rights of others, or in some cases here, we're looking at the costs of these kinds of things, of maintaining order. How do we maintain order? How does government maintain order while also allowing people to express their views and opinions publicly, to assemble, to speak out on specific issues, but again, not to damage property, threaten life, and otherwise. So this is going to be, again, another issue. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see here, and we'll just be following this and see if this plays out, but we're starting to see and not that I have to say this is not the first time this has happened in our country, but we're starting to see things line up around certain constitutional issues related to politics, related to partisanship, related to groups that are on different sides of the political spectrum and how they're engaging with each other. And this can be very, very challenging if this continues along this spectrum, where we see state laws, laws that end up in the courts and so on, that begin to be very controversial and to be focused on these constitutional rights and how they're interpreted and how they're understood and how they play out in states as they implement these laws. So we'll be tracking this and looking at other issues as well as they come up. I don't think we're done here. I think we're going to go through cycles here with various things, from federal resources that are available to states and how they use those, to a focus on certain things like this: protesting, rioting, voting, all of those things that are in the mix of our political expression within our society, but which people see and interpret saying, well, we have to have boundaries, or we have to limit things. We have to use the law itself to try to maintain order, or to give authorities that ability, that foundation that they can stand on in order to act, to either protect life and property, or to have people peacefully demonstrate and protest. So it'll be interesting to see where some of this goes. I wanted to come back to that for a little bit of commentary. But before we wrap up the show today, I wanted to look at another issue going back to the Biden administration, and that was the recognition this past week by President Biden of the Armenian Genocide, the first president since Ronald Reagan to refer to the events on the eve of World War I in 1915 that happened in Turkey. And I want to read you a little background here. This may not be an issue that most people are familiar with, being on the other side of the world, being over a century ago. But this recognition was significant for several reasons. First, it is an issue in which the Turkish government has lobbied against having the U.S. government and specifically the president recognize what happened in the early 20th century in Turkey as a genocide, as the targeted killing of people of a specific ethnic group. And so that has been very much a focus, and a lot of that has been wrapped up in the United States' relationship with Turkey as a NATO ally, its strategic place in the world. But a lot of that has been changing, and there's been strained relationships with Turkey on a number of fronts, not only in what has happened internally within the country in terms of freedoms and what we recognize as important to political expression, but then also because Turkey has been moving closer and closer relationships with Russia. Just buying a new missile defense system from Russia, and engaging with other bilateral type things in terms of their foreign policy. And of course, our view and concerns in this country, or at least the Biden administration, has been looking at Russia in terms of its aggression, Ukraine and other places, but also raising concerns about our relationship and where that is with Russia. And so that's in the mix as well with Turkey. And so I think that provided the opening here, and it was a campaign promise of President Biden when he was running for election to recognize this event. And so for those of you that are not familiar, just a little bit of background here. In the early 20th century, there were 2 million Armenians that were living in the declining Ottoman Empire, so not yet Turkey by that point. But by 1922, there were fewer than 400,000. The others, some 1.5 million, were killed in what many historians consider to be a genocide. And I'm taking this information from a New York Times article that provides a little background on this event. As David Fromkin put it in his widely praised History of World War I and its aftermath, A Peace to End All Peace, rape and beating were commonplace. Those who were not killed at once were driven through mountains and deserts without food, drink, or shelter. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians eventually succumbed or were killed. The man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, a lawyer of Polish Jewish origin, was moved to investigate the attempt to eliminate an entire people by accounts of the massacres of Armenians. He did not, however, coin the word until 1943, applying it to Nazi Germany and the Jews in a book published a year later, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. But to Turks, what happened in 1915 at most was just one more messy piece of very messy war that spelled the end of a once powerful empire. They reject the conclusions of historians and the term genocide, saying there was no premeditation in the deaths, no systematic attempt to destroy a people. Indeed, in Turkey today, it remains a crime, insulting Turkishness, even to raise the issue of what happened to the Armenians. In the United States, a powerful Armenian community centered in Los Angeles has been pressing for years for Congress to condemn the Armenian genocide. Turkey, which cut military ties to France over a similar action, has reacted with angry threats. A bill to that effect nearly passed in the fall of 2007, gaining a majority of co-sponsors and passing a committee vote. But the Bush administration, noting that Turkey is a critical ally, more than 70% of the military air supplies for Iraq go through Incirlik Air Base there, pressed for the bill to be withdrawn, and it was. Under the Ottoman Empire, the empire's rule was also the caliph, or the leader of the Islamic community. Minority religious communities like Christian Armenians were allowed to maintain their religious, social, and legal structures, but were often subject to extra taxes or other measures. Concentrated largely in eastern Anatolia, many of them merchants and industrialists, Armenians, historians say, appeared markedly better off in many ways than their Turkish neighbors, largely small peasants or ill-paid government functionaries and soldiers. At the turn of the 20th century, the once far-flung Ottoman Empire was crumbling at its edges. Beset by revolts among Christian subjects to the north, vast swaths of territory were lost in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13, and the subject of coffeehouse grumbling among Arab nationalist intellectuals in Damascus and everywhere. The Young Turk movement of ambitious, discontented junior army officers seized power in 1908, determined to modernize, strengthen, and Turkify the empire. They were led by what became an all-powerful triumvirate, sometimes referred to as the Three Pashas. In March of 1914, the Young Turks entered World War I on the side of Germany. They attacked to the east, hoping to capture the city of Baku in what would be a disastrous campaign against Russian forces in the Caucasus. They were soundly defeated at the Battle of Sarikamish. Armenians in the area were blamed for siding with the Russians, and the Young Turks began a campaign to portray the Armenians as a kind of fifth column, a threat to the state. Indeed, there were Armenian nationalists who acted as guerrillas and cooperated with the Russians. They briefly seized the city of Van in the spring of 1915. Armenians marked the date of April 24th, 1915, when several hundred Armenian intellectuals were rounded up, arrested, and later executed as the start of the Armenian Genocide, and is generally said to have extended to 1917. However, there were also massacres of Armenians in 1894, 95, and 96, 1909, and a reprise between 1920 and 23. The University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies has compiled figures by province and district that show that there were 2.1 million Armenians in the empire in 1914 and only about 387,000 by 1922. So this is a significant event that happened early in the 20th century. This is what President Biden was responding to and referring to it as genocide. There are certainly politics in the mix here because of Turkey being an ally for so long, but we are seeing some changes in that part of the world. We're seeing some changes in terms of American foreign policy and its relationship with Turkey. And I think this provided the opportunity for President Biden to step forward on this issue and to identify what has happened, or at least recognize on the part of the United States, at least the United States president, of what happened well over a century ago, which is significant. It means it's a significant statement for the Armenian community in this country and around the world in recognizing this because of the impact that it has had on the diaspora, Armenians spread all over the world, but also Armenians in their country of origin. I want to thank you for joining us today on Politics. Join us each week right here on KTRL 90.5 FM for our show focusing on politics and policy at the state, national, federal, and sometimes the local level. And so we'll look forward to having you with us each and every week right here Sundays at noon, or follow us on Facebook so you get interesting articles to read that go along with the topics we cover. Download previous episodes wherever you get your podcast, and listen on SoundCloud. Our full episodes since we began are archived there so that you can go back and listen on great topics. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from me, Taylor Welch, and me, Carissa Cole.
Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.